They called him the ghost of the Bridger Range, a man sitting on a mountain of gold who hadn't spoken a gentle word to a woman in 10 years. The year was 1924, and I was sitting across from my grandson Thomas on the night before he left for the oil fields of Texas. The boy was 19 years old, full of fire and fear in equal measure, and he needed to understand something about choosing who to trust when the whole world is lying to you. My hands, gnarled but still strong at 78 years, traced the grain of the pine table his grandmother had built 3 decades ago. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting shadows that danced across the rough-hewn walls of our homestead. Thomas's enlistment papers lay between us like a challenge. "They tried to burn us alive, Daniel," I said, using his middle name the way I always did when the moment called for gravity. "Your grandmother and I locked the doors, torched the building, and stood outside listening for the screams." The boy set down his coffee cup with a tremor in his hand. He'd heard fragments of this story, whispers around town about the conspiracy, the fire, the resurrection. But never from my lips, never the whole truth. "Before you go off to work for strangers who'll measure your worth in barrels of crude, you need to understand something," I continued. "You need to know how to see what's real when everyone around you is selling pretty lies." From the kitchen came Ruth's voice, still carrying that quiet command that had ruled our mountain for 46 years. "I said you were a porcupine, Nate. Past tense. I sanded down those quills over 34 years of marriage." Thomas grinned despite himself. His grandmother, now 66 years old, moved through our home with the grace of a woman half her age. They called her the Mountain Queen in Ashford Springs. Not Big Ruth, never that, not anymore. It started in November of 1878. I said, letting my mind drift back across the decades. I was 32 years old and I hated every human being I'd ever met. The wind outside picked up rattling the shutters the way it always did when winter came early to the high country. I closed my eyes and I was there again, descending from my claim in the Bridger Range, riding into a town that would try to kill me before the year was out. November 1878. The winter of that year came down hard on the Wyoming territory, but the cold was nothing compared to the ice that had formed around my heart. I stood 6 feet 4 inches in my buffalo hide boots, with shoulders broad enough to carry a felled pine, and a beard that hid a jaw carved from granite and old anger. The people of Ashford Springs had only seen me from a distance for 5 years, a dark silhouette riding the ridgelines of the Bridger Range at dawn and dusk. Rumors about me moved through that town like smoke through a forest. Some said I'd found a vein of gold as thick as a man's arm. Others whispered I'd killed a man in Cheyenne and was hiding from territorial justice. A few claimed I'd gone savage, living more like a wolf than a man in my cabin at the tree line. On a Tuesday in November, the rumors became flesh and blood. The double doors of Gideon's General Store groaned open, letting in a blast of Arctic wind and my towering frame. The chatter inside died like a candle in a gale. The air grew heavy with the smell of pine resin, old leather, and something else. Danger, maybe. Or just the musk of a man who'd chosen solitude over society. I stomped the snow off my boots, the sound echoing like gunshots in that sudden silence. My left boot, a worn piece of buffalo hide I'd stitched myself 3 winters back, had blown its seaming. The sole flapped uselessly with every step, soaking my wool sock in freezing slush. Standing by the counter were the town's self-appointed aristocracy. Charlotte Ashford, a widow who'd buried 2 husbands and was actively shopping for a wealthy third, straightened her velvet hat. Beside her, Evelyn Whitmore, the mayor's daughter, pinched her cheeks to bring out a rosy flush. They'd painted themselves up like saloon girls, though they'd have cut out their tongues before admitting it. Charlotte stepped directly into my path. She was handsome enough, I suppose, in the way a well-maintained piece of furniture is handsome. All surface polish and hidden rot. "Mr. Blackwood," she cooed, ignoring the puddle of mud and snow forming around my boots. "We haven't seen you since the thaw. You must be terribly lonely up in that cabin of yours." My eyes slid over her the way they'd slide over a fence post. I had no more interest in her than I had in the weather. "Move," I said. My voice came out like gravel grinding in a mill. She didn't retreat. Instead, she reached out as if to touch my arm, her smile widening to show too many teeth. "Oh, you poor man. Look at you, you're ragged. If you need a warm meal or company, my door is always." I cut her off, turning my attention to old Gideon behind the counter. Nails, whiskey, tobacco. As I stepped around the Charlotte, my torn boot caught on the rough floorboards. I stumbled and nearly going down before catching myself on a barrel of salted pork. The barrel rocked, brine sloshing. Evelyn's laugh was sharp as a knife designed to cut. "He walks like a broken mule," she whispered, just loud enough for the room to hear. Charlotte covered her mouth, her eyes dancing with malicious delight. My knuckles went white on that barrel. I'd wrestled grizzly bears and survived blizzards that killed grown men, but the contempt of society women could still cut deep, deeper than I cared to admit. Something about their laughter dragged me back to the orphanage in St. Louis, to being the charity case, the boy whose mother had run off with a riverboat gambler and whose father had drunk himself into an early grave. I prepared to storm out to leave the nails and the whiskey and my wounded pride behind. That's when I heard it. "Sit." The voice came from the back of the store. Not a command, not a question. A statement of fact delivered in a tone that expected no argument. From behind a stack of wool blankets emerged a woman I'd never seen before, though later I'd learned she'd lived in Ashford Springs her whole life. Ruth Brennan was 24 years old and the heaviest woman in the territory. She wore a shapeless gray sack of a dress stained with oil and flour. Her dark brown hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she kept her eyes on the floor as she moved. I saw the way Charlotte and Evelyn sneered at her size. I saw the way old Gideon looked annoyed that she'd come out from the stockroom, where he usually kept her hidden. I saw all of it in the space of a heartbeat, and something in my chest twisted with an old familiar rage. "My boot's busted," I said, more defensive than I meant to sound. "I see that," she replied, her voice carrying a quiet dignity that seemed at odds with the shame everyone else expected her to feel. She pointed to a wooden crate near the potbelly stove. "Sit. You'll lose toes to frostbite walking back up the mountain like that." The pretty widows were watching, waiting for me to insult the large girl to put her in what they considered her proper place. Instead, I walked to that crate and sat down. Ruth didn't flirt. She didn't bat her eyelashes or simper or do any of the things Charlotte and Evelyn had been doing. She simply dropped to her knees, a difficult task for a woman of her size, and took my muddy, freezing foot into her lap without a moment's hesitation. Her hands were large, warm, and calloused from years of work. She pulled a heavy needle and a spool of wax sinew from her apron pocket tools she'd clearly been carrying for some time. "Don't look at me," she murmured, sensing my gaze on her bent head. "Just drink your whiskey." For 20 minutes that store was silent, save for the pop and hiss of the stove and the rhythmic shush of Ruth's needle piercing the tough leather. She didn't just patch my boot. She reinforced the heel with a double stitch, the kind a master cobbler in Cheyenne would charge $2 for. She worked with a quiet, focused dignity that seemed to create a bubble of peace around us, shutting out the snickers of the widows in the corner. I found myself watching her hands. They moved with absolute certainty, each stitch placed with the precision of a surgeon. The work was beautiful in its simplicity, functional, and decorative at once. She'd added a small cross-stitch pattern at the ankle, a touch of artistry where none was required. When she finished, she bit the thread with her teeth and set my foot down gently. She used the counter to pull herself back up, breathing hard from the effort, her face flushed red. "That'll hold through spring," she said, not meeting my eyes. I stood and stamped my foot. The boot was solid, better than new. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a gold nugget the size of a robin's egg, one I'd been carrying to trade for supplies. It was worth $50, at least enough to keep her in comfort for 6 months. I held it out to her. Ruth stepped back like I'd offered her a rattlesnake. Her eyes went wide with something that looked like panic. "No," she said, and her voice shook but remained firm. "I didn't do it for pay. I did it because it's cold outside. Keep your gold, Mr. Blackwood." Before I could argue, before I could say anything at all, she turned and shuffled back into the shadows of the stockroom, vanishing like smoke. I stood there in the middle of that general store, staring at the empty doorway where she'd disappeared. Then I looked at the gold in my hand, then at Charlotte and Evelyn, who were staring at the nugget with naked hunger in their eyes, all pretense of refinement forgotten. I put the gold back in my pocket, grabbed a bottle of whiskey from the nearest shelf, threw some coins on the counter, and walked out without another word. Behind me, I heard Charlotte's voice rise in pitch. "Did you see that? She refused gold. Gold, the stupid cow doesn't even know what she's turning down." I kept walking. News of the incident at Gideon's spread through Ashford Springs faster than a prairie fire in August. By noon the next day, everyone knew two things. Nathaniel Blackwood had gold, and he'd been touched by Big Ruth. Most people treated it as a joke. The sheriff laughed about it at the barbershop. Can you imagine the ghost of the Bridger in Big Ruth? He probably thought she was a bear and felt right at home. But in the drafty shack at the edge of town where Ruth lived with her father, there was no laughter. Owen Brennan was a thin, wiry man with the shaking hands of an addict and the yellow teeth of someone who'd spent more money on whiskey than food. When Ruth came home that evening, he was waiting for her, an empty bottle on the rickety table and rage in his bloodshot eyes. "You turned down gold," he screamed, his face purple with fury. "Charlotte Ashford came by, told me all about it. Said that nugget was worth $50 and you said no." Ruth stood by the stove stirring a pot of watery bean soup. She didn't flinch. She'd learned years ago that flinching only made it worse. "It wasn't right, Pa. He was just a customer. I fixed a boot." Owen lunged forward and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to leave bruises. "You stupid, useless cow. I owe $30 to the card sharks at Miller's Saloon. They were going to break my legs, and you're playing high and mighty with a mountain man who's got more gold than sense." Ruth pulled her arm away, but gently. "I'm sorry, Pa." "Sorry don't buy whiskey," Owen spat. Then a calculating look entered his bleary eyes, the kind of look a desperate man gets when he thinks he's found an angle. "But maybe it's not too late. Charlotte says he looked at you, actually looked at you." Ruth felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the drafty cabin. "He was just grateful, Pa. Don't get ideas. He's rich, Ruth, filthy rich, and he's lonely. Men like that, they get desperate in the winter. Start thinking any woman looks good when you've been alone long enough." Owen grinned, showing those yellow teeth. "Tomorrow you're going uppy mountain. You're going to take him a basket of biscuits. You're going to apologize for being rude." "I won't," Ruth said, dropping the ladle. "I have my dignity." "You have what I tell you to have," Owen roared. He raised his hand and Ruth braced herself for the blow. But he stopped himself, some small shred of calculation holding him back. "Or I'll throw you out in the snow and let you starve. Who else would take you in? Look at you." Ruth looked down at her body. She saw what the town saw. A burden, a joke. A woman no man would ever want except out of desperation or pity. She swallowed her tears and nodded. "Good girl." Owen said, his voice softening into something almost paternal. "Wear the blue shawl your mother made. And for God's sake, try to look less." 3 days later, I was chopping wood outside my cabin when I heard the crunch of snow and the labored breathing of a mule struggling through the drifts. I grabbed my Winchester rifle and leveled it at the tree line, expecting bandits or maybe wolves. What I got was a mule carrying a woman wrapped in 3 wool blankets, moving up the steep path toward my claim. It was Ruth Brennan. I lowered the rifle but didn't relax my guard. I watched as she clumsily dismounted, sinking knee-deep into the snow. She was breathing hard, her face pale from the altitude and the effort. We were at 8,000 feet, and the air was thin enough to make a person dizzy if they weren't used to it. "You lost?" I called out, my voice echoing off the canyon walls. Ruth dragged a wicker basket from the saddlebag. She walked toward me, her eyes fixed on my boots, the boots she had fixed 3 days ago. "My father," she wheezed, stopping 10 feet away. "He insisted I bring you this, as an apology, for refusing your payment." I saw the bruise on her upper arm, finger-shaped and fresh, just visible where her shawl had slipped. My eyes narrowed. "Your pa hit you." Ruth flinched and pulled the shawl back up. "That's none of your business, Mr. Blackwood. Here are the biscuits. I'll be going now." "It's a 4-hour ride back," I said, looking up at the sky. "And a blizzard is rolling in over the peaks. You can smell the ozone." Ruth looked at the sky. It was turning a bruised purple, the kind of color that meant snow and lots of it. She looked back at the trail, fear plain in her hazel eyes. "I can make it." "No," I said flatly, "you can't." I turned and walked toward the cabin door. "Get inside unless you want to freeze to death." Ruth hesitated. To enter a bachelor's cabin alone would ruin her reputation completely, what little reputation she had. Then I saw her shoulders straighten slightly, saw some decision being made behind those intelligent eyes. She followed me inside. The cabin's interior stopped her mid-step. From the outside, it looked like a rough pile of logs, barely more than a shelter. Inside, it was something else entirely. A gentleman's library transported to the wilderness. The floors were swept, pine-covered here and there with bearskin rugs. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall with a haunch of venison roasting on a spit. But what really caught the eye were the books. Hundreds of them stacked on shelves that lined every wall. Shakespeare and Plato, Plutarch and geological surveys, medical texts, and Latin grammar. The furniture was hand-carved, showing the kind of precise joinery you'd expect from a master craftsman. Everything was clean, almost obsessively so. "You read?" Ruth asked, unable to hide her shock. "I have a lot of time," I said gruffly, pointing to a chair by the fireplace. "Sit, I'm making stew." For 2 hours the storm raged outside, burying the world in white. Inside, something impossible happened. We talked, not about the weather or town gossip. I asked her about the stitching on my boot, how she'd learned to work leather so well. "My mother," Ruth said softly, looking into the fire. "Before she died, she was a seamstress in Boston. Came west with my father when the railroad was hiring. She taught me that if the inside isn't as beautiful as the outside, the garment is worthless. It'll fall apart under stress." I really looked at her then. The firelight caught her hazel eyes, and I saw the intelligence there, the quiet strength. I saw hands that were capable and strong. I saw a woman who, despite being battered by her father and scorned by the town, held herself with a dignity that most people never achieve. "People in town," I said, my voice low, "they only see the outside, the packaging." "The packaging is all that matters in Ashford Springs," Ruth replied sadly. "Widow Ashford is beautiful," I said. "She's also a viper in silk, and her stitching is rotten." Ruth looked up, shocked by my candor. I leaned forward, my elbows on my knees. "I have a proposition for you, Ruth Brennan." Ruth's heart must have stopped. She gripped her skirt, her knuckles going white. "Mr. Blackwood, please. I am not that kind of woman." I actually chuckled, a dry, rusty sound. "Get your mind out of the gutter. I need a partner, not a mistress." "A partner." "I have gold," I said. "More than people think. 3 veins, not one. But I can't go into town to negotiate contracts without being swarmed by leeches like the mayor and the widow. I need someone I can trust. Someone who can read people. Someone who can mend things that are broken." I paused, holding her gaze. "I need a wife, Ruth. In name. You marry me, you get half the gold." Ruth stared at me like I'd just spoken in Latin. "You want to marry me," the town joke. I stood up and offered her my hand. It was the size of a bear paw, scarred from years of hard work. "Let them laugh," I said. "I prefer a sturdy boot to a painted slipper any day. What do you say?" Ruth looked at my hand. She thought about her father's rage and the cold shack and the way the townspeople looked through her as if she didn't exist. Then she looked at the books in the fire and the man who saw her worth. She reached out and took my hand. "I say yes." I have to pause here because Thomas interrupted me at this point, his young face full of disbelief. "Wait," he said. "You proposed after knowing her for 2 hours." I refilled my coffee cup, taking my time. "Sometimes you know in 2 minutes, boy. Sometimes you never know at all. Your grandmother, I saw her refuse gold she desperately needed because taking it felt wrong to her. That's character. You can't fake that." From the kitchen came Ruth's voice, dry as sand. "He's romanticizing it, Thomas." I said yes, because I was desperate, and he seemed less dangerous than my father. I grinned. And now, Ruth appeared in the doorway carrying a pie that smelled of cinnamon and apples. She set it down and kissed my scarred knuckles, a gesture as natural as breathing after all these years. "Now you're more dangerous," she said, "but I'm dangerous too." She looked at Thomas. "Make him tell you about the shotgun." "Shotgun?" Thomas asked. "Later," I said. "First the wedding." I let my mind drift back again, back to those mountains in 1878. The blizzard lasted 2 full days. When the sky finally cleared to a piercing, brilliant blue, the town of Ashford Springs looked like a toy village buried in cotton. The peace was shattered at noon when I rode down Main Street with Ruth Brennan in my arms. She sat side saddle in front of me on midnight, my black stallion wrapped in my buffalo coat. My arms formed a shield around her against the wind and against the stairs. The town stopped. The blacksmith dropped his hammer. The baker came out wiping flour from his hands. They watched in stunned silence as the ghost of the Bridger Range rode straight up to Judge Hartley's office, my face set like a stone mask. I dismounted and lifted Ruth down. She was trembling, not from cold, but from the weight of 100 staring eyes. "Head up," I whispered near her ear, my voice a low rumble. "You're with me now. You don't bow to anyone." We entered the dusty office together. Judge Hartley, a balding man with spectacles, perched on a red nose that nearly fell out of his chair. "Nathaniel Blackwood," he stammered. "I didn't expect to see you until spring. Did you kill a man?" "I'm here to get married," I stated, walking Ruth to the desk. The judge cleaned his glasses frantically, looking from the scarred mountain man to the heavy, shy girl standing in a puddle of melting snow. "Married to Owen Brennan's girl, Ruth?" "Is there a law against it?" I asked, my hand resting on the Bowie knife at my hip. No, of course not. Just unexpected." The ceremony was short. No flowers, no organ music. Just the scratching of a pen and the ticking of a grandfather clock marking out the seconds. When it came time for the ring, I didn't produce some delicate, store-bought trinket. I pulled a leather cord from around my neck. Hanging from it was a ring of heavy hammered Spanish gold, set with a rough-cut ruby the size of a thumbnail. "My grandmother's," I said, sliding it onto Ruth's finger. "She was from Santa Fe. It's the only thing I have from before." The ring fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Ruth stared at the jewel. It was worth more than her father's life, more than the entire block she'd grown up on. Tears pricked her eyes. "By the power vested in me by the Wyoming Territory," Judge Hartley declared, stamping the paper, "I pronounce you man and wife." Before the ink was dry, the door banged open. Owen Brennan stood there panting, his eyes wild. He'd heard the news from the baker. He looked at Ruth, then at the gold ring on her hand, and greed twisted his face into a mask of ugliness. "You can't do this," Owen shouted, stumbling into the room. "She's my daughter, my property until I say otherwise. You stole her away like a thief." Ruth shrank back, old instincts taking over. She waited for the blow that had defined her childhood, but I stepped between them. I didn't yell or rage. I simply occupied the space, a towering wall of muscle and quiet menace. "She was your property," I said calmly. "Now she's my wife. Under the law, her debts are my debts, and her protection is my duty." I reached into my coat and pulled out a leather pouch. I tossed it through the air. It hit Owen in the chest with a heavy clink. $200 in gold dust," I said. "That pays for every scrap of food she ate in your house and every debt you owe the saloon. Take it and drink yourself to death, Owen. But if you ever come within 50 feet of Mrs. Blackwood again, I will bury you on the mountain where no one will ever find the grave." Owen clutched the bag. The fight drained out of him instantly. He looked at the money, then at his daughter. He didn't even say goodbye. He turned and ran toward the saloon, already thinking about his first drink. Ruth let out a sob that had been building for 20 years. I turned to her, my expression softening just a fraction. I took a handkerchief from my pocket and wiped her cheek. "Tears are done, Ruth," I said. "Let's go. We have business." We walked out of that office and into the street. A crowd had gathered. Charlotte Ashford and Evelyn Whitmore stood at the front, wrapped in furs, their faces pale with shock. They saw the ruby on Ruth's finger. It caught the sunlight, blazing like a drop of blood. "It can't be real," Evelyn whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. "He's mocking her. It's a game." I stopped. I looked at the crowd. Then I took Ruth's hand, raised it to my lips, and kissed her knuckles. It was a gesture of respect usually reserved for queens, not seamstresses. "My wife," I announced, my voice carrying down the street. "Mrs. Nathaniel Blackwood. Treat her with the respect she's due, or answer to me." I guided her not to the livery stable, but to the Grand Hotel, the only brick building in town. "Best suite," I told the clerk, "and send for the dressmaker, Mrs. Patterson. Tell her to bring her entire stock." For the next 7 days, I didn't return to the mountain. I stayed in Ashford Springs, forcing them to look at it, forcing them to see what I saw. Mrs. Patterson, a stern Scottish woman who cared more for coin than gossip, measured Ruth with professional efficiency. "You have a waist, girl," she mumbled, around a mouthful of pins. "Buried under those sacks you wear, but it's there. And your shoulders are regal. You're built like a statue, not a scarecrow like those Ford women. For the first time in years, Ruth received a compliment. She cried and Mrs. Patterson told her to stop leaking because she couldn't measure a moving target. I ordered 7 dresses: deep emerald green for daywear, midnight blue for evening, burgundy wool for traveling. Each one was crafted to flatter rather than hide, to emphasize rather than diminish. And with each dress, I watched Ruth transform. Not her body, but her bearing. The way she held her head, the way she moved through space. The midnight blue dress was the revelation. When Mrs. Patterson forced Ruth to stand before the full-length mirror, I saw Ruth see herself for the first time. Really see herself. "I look like I matter," she whispered. "You always mattered," I said from the doorway. "Now you look like you know it." We took our meals in the hotel restaurant. I ordered normal portions and ate with her, making the meals social rather than shameful. I talked about mining and books and the geology of the Bridger Range. Anything to make her forget that she was eating to let food become fuel rather than shame. After 3 days, she stopped looking at the floor. On the 4th evening, over roasted trout and potatoes, I told her the truth. "They're afraid of you." Ruth's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Who?" "The town. They're laughing at me. They think I'm a circus freak you bought." I shook my head, pouring wine into her glass. "No, they used to laugh because you were weak. Now they hate you because you have what they want." "What do I have?" "Safety, loyalty." I leaned in. "Charlotte Ashford has been trying to marry money for 10 years. Evelyn Whitmore thinks her father's title makes her royalty. You walked in and took the prize without lifting a finger. That makes them dangerous." Understanding dawned in Ruth's eyes. "They'll try to separate us." "Let them try." I didn't tell her about the conversation I'd overheard that afternoon when I'd walked past the mayor's mansion and heard voices through an open window. Plotting voices, angry voices. I didn't tell her because I wanted her to have these 7 days of peace, of discovering what it felt like to be treated with respect. But I knew the vipers were circling, and I knew that before the month was out, they'd strike. What I didn't know was that when they did, it would be Ruth who'd save us both. The viper's den was prettier than most people expected. Mayor Preston Whitmore's mansion stood 3 stories tall on the hill overlooking Ashford Springs, a Victorian monument to territorial ambition. Persian rugs covered the floors. Gas lamps cast warm light over French brandy and imported cigars. It was the kind of place where evil wore a pleasant smile and spoke in cultured tones. On the 7th night of our stay in town, while Ruth and I dined on venison and talked about Shakespeare, 3 people gathered in that mansion's parlor to plot our destruction. Preston Whitmore paced the Persian rug, his waxed mustache twitching with agitation. His expensive vest was buttoned tight over a paunch that spoke of too many rich meals and too little honest work. He was 52 years old and looked older, the kind of aging that comes from worry and debt. Charlotte Ashford sat on the settee sipping brandy with the delicate precision of a woman who'd perfected the art of appearing refined while thinking murderous thoughts. At 38, she was still beautiful in a cold, calculated way. But beauty fades, and Charlotte knew it. She needed money before her looks ran out completely. Evelyn Whitmore sulked by the window, her pretty face twisted into an ugly expression. At 24, she'd been raised to believe that her father's position as mayor made her territorial royalty. The idea that a fat seamstress, had won the richest bachelor in Wyoming was more than her pride could bear. "It's an embarrassment," Charlotte hissed, setting down her brandy with enough force to make the glass ring. "The richest man in the territory parading that mountain cow around like she's a duchess, and the way she looks at him like she actually owns him." "I'm worried about the gold," Preston muttered, pausing his pacing. "I've been trying to get Blackwood to invest in the railroad spur for 3 years. He ignored every letter, every invitation. Now he's spending thousands on silk and French perfume for that girl." Evelyn turned from the window, her voice venomous. "If they have a child, that gold is gone forever. It stays in their family. We'll never see a penny of it." The room went silent. The thought of a Blackwood heir, half mountain savage and half town outcast, inheriting the wealth of the Bridger Range was intolerable. "We need to separate them," Charlotte said, her eyes taking on a reptilian gleam. Preston stopped pacing. "Hal Blackwood's not stupid. He knows we want his money." Charlotte smiled, and it was not a pleasant thing to see. Nathaniel is a proud man, a jealous man. He's lived alone for a decade. He doesn't know women. He doesn't know if Ruth Brennan was pure before he married her. Everyone knows she's never touched a man, Preston objected. Exactly, Charlotte said. But Nathaniel doesn't know for sure. He's been on that mountain. He doesn't know what she might have done to pay Owen's gambling debts while he was away. Preston's eyes widened. That's slander. Dangerous slander. Blackwood will kill anyone who lies to him. Then we don't lie, Charlotte said smoothly. We simply plant the seed. We use someone Nathaniel already despises to water it. Owen's too scared now, Preston said. Not Owen, Charlotte replied. Someone bolder. Someone new to town. Someone who looks like he could turn a woman's head. She turned to the corner of the room where a shadow had been standing silently throughout their conversation. Garrett Hayes stepped into the light. He was 29 years old, handsome in the way of professional gamblers and confidence men. Dark hair, green eyes, a practiced smile that had separated fools from their money in a dozen territorial towns. He was Preston's illegitimate nephew from Denver, kept around for exactly this kind of dirty work. Garrett, Charlotte purred, how would you like to earn $500? Garrett flipped a silver dollar over his knuckles, a trick he'd perfected in saloons from Cheyenne to Santa Fe. I'd like that very much, Mrs. Ashford. Who do I have to shoot? No shooting, Charlotte said. Seduction, or at least the appearance of it. I want you to make Nathaniel Blackwood believe his blushing bride is a harlot. Garrett's smile widened. When do I start? Tuesday, Preston said. Blackwood rides out to check his mining claim every Tuesday morning. That's when you'll encounter his wife, in public, with witnesses. Charlotte leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I did my research on Nair Mountain Man. In 1873, Nathaniel was briefly engaged to a Denver socialite named Margaret Pemberton. She accepted his proposal, wore his ring for 2 weeks, then jilted him at the altar when she discovered his mother had been a prostitute. That humiliation is why he fled to the mountains. So he's already primed to believe women lie, Evelyn said, understanding dawning. Precisely, Charlotte replied. All we have to do is confirm his worst fear, make him doubt. Once doubt enters a marriage, it's like rotten timber. It spreads until the whole structure collapses. They refined their plan over the next hour. Every detail was calculated. The timing, the location, the witnesses who would swear to what they saw. By the time they finished, they'd convinced themselves it was foolproof. What they didn't account for was that Nathaniel Blackwood had survived a decade in the wilderness by trusting his instincts over appearances. And his instincts told him that Ruth Brennan was incapable of deception. Tuesday morning arrived with clear skies and bitter cold. I prepared to ride up to my claim, a weekly trip I'd been making for 5 years. My mining crew needed checking supplies, needed accounting, and I needed to see the veins with my own eyes to make sure no one was skimming gold. I stood in our hotel suite pulling on my heavy coat when Ruth emerged from the bedroom. She wore the burgundy wool dress, and she moved with a confidence that still surprised me. 7 days had transformed her, not in body, but in bearing. I'll be back by sunset, I told her. Stay inside or take the guard if you go out. Ruth's chin lifted slightly. I'm not a prisoner, Nate. I paused at the door. No, but you're a target. Charlotte Ashford doesn't forgive humiliation. I can handle Charlotte. I studied her for a moment. She probably could handle Charlotte in a fair fight, but Charlotte didn't fight fair. Be careful, I said. I will. I should have stayed. I should have trusted the cold weight in my gut that said something was wrong. But duty called, and I was a man who honored his obligations. So I rode out, leaving Ruth alone in a town full of vipers. After I left, Ruth sat with her embroidery for perhaps an hour. But the walls of the hotel suite began to feel like a cage. She'd spent her whole life being told where she could and couldn't go, what she could and couldn't do. Now she was a married woman with a gold ring on her finger and a wealthy husband. Surely she could walk to the livery stable without an escort. She had an idea. My saddle was 15 years old, the leather cracked and worn. She would buy me a new one as a surprise, a gift from a wife to her husband. Something normal, something that wives did. She slipped out the back entrance of the hotel and headed down the alley toward the stables. She never made it. As Ruth passed the alley behind Miller's saloon, a hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. She spun around, her heart hammering, to find herself face to face with Garrett Hayes. Well, well, he said, his voice smooth as oil. If it isn't the Queen of Ashford Springs. Ruth yanked her arm away. Let me pass. Garrett stepped forward, blocking her path against the brick wall. In a rush, darling Blackwood leaves you alone for 5 minutes, and you're already wandering the streets. Maybe you're looking for something he can't give you. I'm looking for a saddle, Ruth said coldly. Move. What happened next was carefully choreographed. Garrett lunged forward and grabbed Ruth by the waist, pulling her flush against him. He ripped the lace collar of her dress. He mussed her hair with a rough hand. He smeared lipstick, which he'd obtained from a prostitute that morning, across his own cheek. The whole attack took perhaps 5 seconds. Ruth screamed and shoved him with all her considerable strength. She was stronger than Garrett expected. The gambler stumbled backward and tripped over a crate that had been conveniently placed there earlier. The damage was done. The back door of the saloon opened. Mayor Whitmore and 3 town councilmen stepped out right on cue. They gasped in theatrical shock at the scene before them. And riding up the street, returning early because of a broken wagon wheel at the mine, was Nathaniel Blackwood. The silence that descended on that alley was heavier than any blizzard. I reined in my horse so hard that Midnight reared his hooves, pawing the air. I saw my wife in the alley. I saw her torn dress. I saw a handsome stranger wiping lipstick from his cheek. I saw the mayor and his cronies watching me with expressions of scandalized horror. For a moment, the world narrowed to a single point of white-hot rage. Garrett played his part perfectly. He looked at me with mock terror, then winked at Ruth. Next time, sweetie, don't be so rough. He laughed, backing away. I sat on my horse motionless. My face went completely blank. It was the face of the mountain before an avalanche. The face I'd learned in the orphanage when showing emotion only brought more beatings. Ruth ran toward me, her hands reaching up. Nate, no. He attacked me. He grabbed me. I looked down at her. I saw the torn lace. I saw fear in her eyes, fear that I wouldn't believe her. I looked at Garrett Hayes retreating behind the mayor for protection. I looked at Preston Whitmore stepping forward with feigned indignation. I saw it with my own eyes, Mr. Blackwood, the mayor said. They were embracing, disgusting behavior in a public alleyway. One of the councilmen chimed in. She signaled him. I saw her wave him over. The other witnesses nodded their lies, coordinated and smooth. Ruth looked up at me, her heart hammering against her ribs. Nate, look at me. Look at my eyes. I'm your wife. They are lying. The tension stretched thin and screaming. My hand hovered over my gun. The crowd that had begun to gather held its collective breath. I looked at the mayor. I looked at Garrett Hayes. And then I really looked at Ruth. I remembered the woman who'd fixed my boot in silence, asking nothing in return. I remembered the woman who'd walked through a blizzard to bring me biscuits. I remembered the woman who'd told me she had dignity and then proved it by refusing gold she desperately needed. I swung my leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground. The earth seemed to shake when my boots hit. I walked past Ruth. I walked straight up to Garrett Hayes. You say she embraced you? I asked softly. Garrett sneered, feeling safe with the mayor beside him. She couldn't keep her hands off me. Strange, I said, because my wife has a tell when she touches something she likes. She fixes it. But when she touches something she hates, I move faster than a striking rattlesnake. I grabbed Garrett Hayes by the throat and lifted him. Actually lifted him, his boots leaving the ground, and slammed him against the brick wall hard enough to crack mortar. She breaks it, I growled. Garrett's feet kicked helplessly. The color drained from his handsome face, turning from tan to paste. I tightened my grip. Tell me the truth, or I will snap your neck like a dry twig. Garrett clawed at my wrist. It was like clawing at a tree trunk. I loosened my grip just enough to let air pass. Speak. My wife says she didn't want you. You say she did. One of you is lying. And I know my wife doesn't lie. She's too proud for it. Garrett looked desperately at the mayor, but Preston Whitmore had taken a step back, his eyes darting for an escape route. He'd realized too late that the mountain man wasn't just a brute. He was a predator who'd sensed the trap. It was a joke. Garrett wheezed, tears streaming down his face. Just a joke, a bet. A bet, my voice dropped to a terrifyingly low register. You bet on my wife's virtue. No, they paid me, hey, Garrett screamed, pointing a shaking finger at the mayor. Ford and the widow Ashford. They gave me $500 to ruin her. They said if you thought she was loose, you'd throw her out and leave the gold in town. A collective gasp went through the crowd that had gathered at the mouth of the alley. The shopkeeper, the baker, the blacksmith, all of them listening, all of them hearing the truth. I dropped Garrett. He hit the mud with a wet thud, gasping for air and massaging his bruised throat. I didn't look at him again. I stepped over him like he was trash and walked toward Preston Whitmore. The mayor began to tremble. Now, Nate, Mr. Blackwood, let's be reasonable. The boy is a liar. You can't believe a drifter over your mayor. I stopped 2 feet from him. I towered over the rotund official. I believe the man who's afraid of dying, I said. He has no reason to lie anymore. I reached into my coat pocket. For a second, Preston thought I was going for a gun and nearly fainted. But I pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a bank draft. I was at the bank this morning, Preston, I said calmly. I was buying the deed to the land adjacent to my mine. But the banker, Mr. Henderson, was very chatty. He told me about the town's debts. He told me about your debts. Preston went pale. It seems, I continued unfolding the paper, that you borrowed heavily against the town treasury to invest in a silver mine in Nevada. A mine that came up dry. You're broke, Preston, and you were banking on my gold to bail you out. I ripped the paper in half. Then I ripped it again. I just bought your debt, I announced, my voice carrying to the crowd. Every cent you owe the bank, you now owe to me. I own your house. I own your livery stable. I own the chair you sit in at City Hall. Ruth watched from the wall, clutching her torn dress. She'd never seen power used like this. Her father had used fists. The town had used cruel words. I used the weight of the world itself. You have 24 hours to vacate the mayor's mansion, I said, throwing the confetti of paper at Preston's feet. Take your daughter and your schemes and get out of my town. You can't do this, Preston shrieked, his dignity shattering. I am the law here. Not anymore, I rumbled. I turned my back on him and walked to Ruth. I didn't ask if she was okay. I knew she wasn't. I took off my heavy buffalo coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, covering the torn dress. I buttoned it at the chin with gentle, clumsy fingers. Let's go home, I said softly. To the mountain, she asked, her voice trembling. To the hotel, I corrected. We have dinner reservations. As we walked out of that alley, the crowd parted for us like the Red Sea. No one looked at Ruth with pity anymore. They looked at her with awe. She was under the protection of the ghost of the Bridger Range, and she was the only thing standing between the town and my wrath. Back in the hotel suite, the adrenaline faded, leaving Ruth shaking. She sat on the edge of the velvet bed while I poured water into a basin. I dipped a cloth and wrung it out. I can do it, Ruth said, reaching for the cloth. Sit, I said. I knelt before her just as she had knelt before me in the general store to fix my boot. I wiped the dirt from her cheek. I wiped the smeared lipstick the gambler had left. I cleaned her hands with the same care she'd shown my worn boot. I'm sorry, Ruth whispered, tears finally spilling over. I just wanted to buy you a saddle. I caused all this trouble. I stopped. I took her face in my large, rough hands. You didn't cause it, I said firmly. You revealed it. You showed me who the snakes were. A man can't kill a snake if he can't see it in the grass. I looked at her intensely. You are worth more than the gold, Ruth. I saw you shove him. You're a fighter. Ruth leaned into my touch. For the first time in her life, she felt small. Not because she was humiliated, because she was held. She was safe. Nate, she breathed. I kissed her then, not tentatively, possessive, hungry, full of the pent-up passion of a man who'd lived in the cold too long. Ruth didn't pull away. She wrapped her arms around my neck, pulling me closer, mending the lonely places in my soul, just as she'd mended my boot. The victory over the mayor should have been the end of it. But a wounded animal is the most dangerous kind, and the civilized people of Ashford Springs were proving more savage than any wolf pack I'd faced in the wilderness. Preston Whitmore didn't pack his bags. Instead, he barricaded himself in City Hall with Sheriff Coleman and a posse of hired guns who drifted into town looking for blood money. Charlotte Ashford, stripped of her dignity and facing social ruin, turned her venom into a weapon. She went door to door, whispering a new lie. She told people that Nathaniel Blackwood was insane. She claimed I'd forced the banker to sell the debts at gunpoint. She said I planned to burn the town down and take the land for grazing. Fear makes people stupid. By sunset the next day, a mob had formed. Ruth and I were finishing dinner in the hotel dining room when a brick smashed through the front window. It landed on our table, shattering the china and spraying us with glass. Tied to the brick was a note, two words in crude letters, leave or burn. I stood up slowly, brushing glass from my sleeve. My face was a mask of cold fury. Stay here, I told Ruth. No, Ruth said, standing up. She grabbed a steak knife from the table. I am not staying behind while you face them. I looked at the knife in her hand, then at the fire in her eyes. I nodded once, stay behind me. We walked out onto the hotel veranda. The street was filled with torches. 50 men, fueled by Preston's whiskey and Charlotte's lies, stood shouting in the gathering darkness. Sheriff Coleman stood at the front, his hand on his holster. Nathaniel Blackwood, the sheriff yelled, you are under arrest for extortion and threatening a public official. Surrender your weapon. I bought a debt, Coleman. I called back, my voice calm but booming. That's commerce, not extortion. Go home before you get hurt. We don't take orders from mountain trash, someone in the crowd yelled. A gunshot rang out. The bullet struck the wooden pillar inches from my head, sending splinters flying. I didn't flinch. In one fluid motion, I drew my Colt Peacemaker. I didn't aim at the crowd. I aimed at the rope holding the heavy iron chandelier above the hotel entrance. I fired. The rope snapped. The massive iron fixture crashed down onto the steps between me and the mob, sending sparks and shattered glass flying in every direction. Horses reared, men scattered. The careful formation of the mob dissolved into chaos. Next one goes between your eyes, Coleman, I roared. The mob wavered. They were bullies, not soldiers. They'd come for spectacle, not actual violence. But then a voice shrieked from the shadows. Burn them out, he's a devil. It was Charlotte Ashford. She threw a lit kerosene lantern onto the dry wooden porch of the hotel. The flames caught instantly. The varnish on the wood sizzled and popped. The fire raced up the trellis, blocking the front entrance. I grabbed Ruth and shoved her through the doors. Just as the entrance became a wall of fire, the lobby was filling with smoke. The clerk had already fled. Back exit, I coughed, pulling Ruth toward the kitchen. But when we kicked open the back door, we found it blocked. A heavy wagon had been rolled in front of it, wedged tight against the frame. It was a trap. We were meant to roast alive. They want us dead, Ruth coughed, the salt stinging her eyes. Nate, there's no way out. I looked around the kitchen. The heat was rising. I saw the narrow pantry window high up on the wall. It was too small for me. Ruth, I said, grabbing a stool, the window. You can fit. Climb out, run to the livery, get the horses. I'm not leaving you, Ruth cried. You can't fit through that. I said, I'll hold them off. I'll break through the front once you're clear. Go, Ruth grabbed my face with both hands. No, I'm not the woman who runs away. She looked at the floorboards. This is the hotel kitchen. The root cellar door is under that rug. It leads to the storm drain that empties into the creek bed. I used to hide there when my father was drunk. I looked at her in amazement. She knew the guts of this town better than the mayor did. Show me, I said. We threw back the rug. A heavy iron ring was set into the floorboards, rusted shut from years of disuse. I gripped it with both hands. I roared, the veins in my neck bulging, my back muscles straining against the fabric of my shirt. With a shriek of tortured metal, the trapdoor gave way. Cool, damp air rushed up to meet us. Go, I commanded. Ruth lowered herself into the darkness. I followed, pulling the trapdoor shut above us just as the kitchen ceiling collapsed in a shower of sparks. We crawled through the damp, rat-infested tunnel for what felt like miles. It smelled of sewage and mud. Ruth's silk dress was ruined, tearing on sharp rocks, but she didn't care. She crawled with a determination that matched mine. We emerged onto the frozen, muddy bank of Ashford Creek, coughing and gasping for air. Above us on Main Street, the Grand Hotel was a tower of flame lighting up the night sky. The mob was cheering, thinking the monster and his bride were dead. I stood up in the knee-deep water, washing the soot from my eyes. I looked up at the burning building, then at Ruth, who was covered in mud, shivering but alive. I checked my gun. 3 bullets left. They think we're dead, Ruth said. That's good, I replied, my voice cold as the grave. Why is it good? Because ghosts are harder to kill, I said. And tonight, Ashford Springs is going to be haunted. I turned to Ruth, checking her for injuries beyond scratches and bruises. Can you ride? Ruth wrung mud from her skirt. I can walk through fire. I can ride. I pointed toward the shadows of the railway depot. There's a telegraph office there. The operator owes me a favor. We're calling in the cavalry. Cavalry. I don't just have gold. Ruth, I supply U.S. Marshals with information on outlaws in the territory. Sheriff Coleman isn't the law. I am the witness. But before we could move, a silhouette stepped out from under the bridge. It was Owen Brennan. Ruth's father emerged from the shadows holding a double-barreled shotgun. His hands shook violently. The firelight from the burning hotel reflected in his watery, bloodshot eyes. They promised me, Owen wept. Charlotte promised me $1,000 if I made sure you didn't come out of the creek. She knew about the tunnel, Ruth, remembered you talking about it years ago. I stepped in front of Ruth. Put it down, Owen. You miss your dead. I can't, Owen sobbed. I have to do it or they'll kill me. He cocked the hammers. The sound seemed to swallow the world. Ruth did something I didn't expect. She stepped forward. She didn't hide behind her husband. She walked through the icy mud until the shotgun barrels were inches from her chest. Pull it, Pa, Ruth said softly. Owen sobbed a wretched, broken sound. They'll kill me, Ruth. Ruth's voice was steady, resonant with the strength she'd found in the fire. They'll kill you and you believe them. Just like you believed the bottom of a bottle would solve your problems. She reached out and placed her hand over the barrels of the gun. Look at me, Pa, really look at me. Am I the girl who cowered in the corner while you drank, or am I the woman who just walked through fire? Owen looked up. In the moonlight, he didn't see the useless cow he'd ridiculed for years. He saw his wife's eyes staring back at him, judgmental and sorrowful. He saw a queen. His resolve shattered. Owen dropped the shotgun into the creek with a splash. He fell to his knees, covering his face with his grime-stained hands. I'm sorry, he wept. God, Ruth, I'm so sorry. I moved then. I picked up the shotgun, broke the breech, and pocketed the shells. Go, I told Owen. Walk west. Don't stop until you hit California. If I ever see your face in Wyoming again, I won't be as kind as your daughter. Owen didn't argue. He scrambled up the bank, weeping, and vanished into the darkness of the trees. He left his shame and his only child behind. Forever. Ruth stood silent, a single tear tracking down her soot-stained cheek. You all right? I asked. No, Ruth said, but I will be. Let's finish this. Dawn broke over Ashford Springs with a deceptively peaceful light. The ruins of the Grand Hotel were still smoking, a blackened scar on the town's face. A crowd had gathered in the town square, drawn by the spectacle of destruction and the certainty that the mountain man and his bride had perished in the flames. Mayor Preston Whitmore stood on the scorched steps of City Hall, looking appropriately solemn. Beside him was Charlotte Ashford, dressed in black, dabbing at dry eyes with a handkerchief. They were performing grief and performing it well. My friends, Preston bellowed, his voice thick with manufactured sorrow. It is a tragedy, a terrible accident. It seems a lantern in the lobby well, we couldn't save them. Nathaniel Blackwood and his poor wife have perished. Charlotte nodded, lifting her handkerchief to her face. It is a lesson, she said loud enough for the women in the front row to hear. That sort of man, wild, uncivilized, he brought ruin upon himself and poor Ruth. If only she had stayed in her place. Preston shifted gears smoothly to business. We will mourn them, of course, but life must go on. As mayor, and given that Mr. Blackwood had no other living heirs, I will take temporary custody of his assets to settle the town's debts, and... Is that so, Preston? The voice cracked through the morning air like a whip. The crowd gasped and turned as one. Walking down the center of Main Street were two figures that looked like they had crawled out of the grave itself. Their clothes were torn and caked with mud. Their faces were smeared with soot and grime. But they walked with their heads held high, moving with the certainty of people who had passed through death and come out the other side. Nathaniel Blackwood limped slightly, his hand resting on the handle of his Colt. Beside him, Ruth marched forward, her ruined silk dress flowing like a battle standard. A ghost! Someone screamed. Preston's face turned the color of curdled milk. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Nate, he finally stammered. You're dead. Disappointed, I asked, stepping up onto the porch. The crowd parted instantly, terrified of the man they'd thought had burned in hellfire. I could see it in their faces. They'd convinced themselves we were dead, had even begun to celebrate the fact. Now we stood before them, solid and real, and their comfortable story had shattered. Preston backed up until he hit the charred wall. "This is a misunderstanding. We thought the fire," Ruth's voice rang out clear and true. "The fire you set," she pointed a mud-caked finger at Charlotte Ashford. "The fire you started with a lantern, Charlotte. I saw you." "Liar," Charlotte shrieked, her composure finally cracking. "She's hysterical. Sheriff, arrest her." Sheriff Coleman moved his hand toward his gun, but he stopped cold at the sound of approaching horses. From the other end of the street came the thunder of hooves. 6 riders in dusters galloped into the square, pulling up in a cloud of dust. The lead rider wore a silver star on his chest. Not the local tin star of a territorial sheriff. The badge of a United States Marshal. "Nobody move," the marshal shouted, leveling a Winchester rifle at the crowd. I looked at the marshal and nodded. "Right on time, Davis." Marshal Davis was a lean man in his 50s, with gray in his beard and eyes that had seen enough of human nature to be surprised by very little. "You sent the wire 3 days ago, Blackwood," he said, dismounting but keeping his rifle ready. "Said you had evidence of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit murder. I didn't think I'd be riding into a crime scene." Preston's face went from pale to ashen. "3 days ago," he whispered, looking at me with horror. "But the fire was last night." I stepped close enough that Preston could smell the smoke still clinging to my clothes. "I told you, Preston, I didn't come to town to buy dresses. I came to audit the books. I knew you were stealing from the mine contracts before I even married Ruth. I just needed you to play your hand." I turned to address the crowd directly. "This man," I gestured to Preston, "stole your taxes to pay his gambling debts. And when he couldn't pay me back, he tried to burn me and my wife alive." The crowd murmured, the tide of public opinion turning like a ship changing course. "And her," I pointed to Charlotte. "She bribed a father to kill his own daughter." "No," Charlotte cried as the marshal's deputies moved in. "I am a lady. You can't touch me." Ruth stepped forward, looking Charlotte up and down with an expression that mixed pity with contempt. "You're no lady. You're just an empty shell. And your stitching is rotten." The deputies handcuffed Preston Sheriff Coleman and a weeping Charlotte Ashford. As they were dragged away, Charlotte looked at the crowd pleading for help. But she found no sympathy, only the cold, hard stares of a town that finally saw the truth. We didn't stay for the trial. We didn't stay for the town's apologies, though. They came in waves. The baker brought fresh bread. The blacksmith offered to rebuild the hotel. Mrs. Patterson brought replacement dresses and refused payment. Old Gideon approached, hat in hands, shame written across his weathered face. "Mr. Blackwood, Mrs. Blackwood," he said, "I'm ashamed. I stood by while they mocked Ruth. I'm sorry." I studied him for a long moment. "You want forgiveness. I want a chance to do better." I reached into my coat and pulled out the deed to the general store. I'd bought it along with Preston's other properties when I'd purchased his debt. "This is yours again, free and clear. One condition: you treat every customer with respect, no matter their size, station, or coin." "Understood." Gideon's eyes filled with tears. "Understood." That afternoon, Ruth and I stood at the edge of town looking up at the Bridger Range. The peaks were covered in snow that sparkled like diamonds in the afternoon sun. "We could stay," Ruth said quietly, "rebuild the hotel, run the town properly." "We could," I agreed, but I didn't build that cabin to run a town. I built it to have peace, and I've found that peace doesn't come from a place, it comes from a person." I looked at her. "The mountain is home because you're there. Town is just noise." Ruth smiled, and it was like watching the sun come out from behind clouds. "Then let's go home." We packed the mule. I lifted Ruth onto Midnight, and she wrapped her arms around my waist. "You ready?" she asked. "To the cabin." "To the mountain," Ruth corrected. "It's not just a cabin anymore. It's a home." We rode out of Ashford Springs as the sun reached its zenith, turning the snow on the peaks to blinding white gold. We didn't look back. The first year on the mountain passed like a dream. Winter gave way to spring, spring to summer, summer to the golden days of autumn, and back to winter again. Through it all, Ruth and I learned each other. I taught her how to read weather in the clouds, how to shoot a Winchester, how to track elk through fresh snow. She was a natural shot, her hands steady from years of fine needlework. Ruth taught me how to read Shakespeare aloud, not just silently to myself. She taught me how to dance awkward and tender in front of the fireplace on cold winter nights. She taught me how to laugh again, something I'd forgotten how to do. On Christmas Eve of that first year, Ruth gave me a buckskin jacket she'd made in secret. It was hand-stitched and decorated with quill work she'd learned from a Shoshone woman at the trading post. "This is museum quality," I said, running my fingers over the intricate patterns. "You're worth museum quality," Ruth replied simply. My gift to her was a small, leather-bound journal with her initials embossed on the cover. "You should write," I told her. "You have a way with words. I've heard you talking to the horses." Ruth laughed. "You've been listening to me talk to horses. You are more interesting than they are." In January, we endured a brutal cold snap that kept us snowed in for 2 weeks. Temperatures dropped to 30 below zero. But instead of driving us apart, the isolation forged us together. We read the entire Shakespeare canon in loud alternating voices. We argued philosophy over the chessboard. Ruth wrote poetry and showed me some of her pieces. I was genuinely moved by them. One night by the fire, Ruth traced the scar on my shoulder, the one from the grizzly attack. "Tell me," she said. "Not much to tell. Bear was protecting her cubs. I got between them. Stupid mistake." "Then what?" "Fought her off with my knife. She left. I sewed myself up with fishing line and whiskey." Ruth's eyes went wide with horror. "Alone you could have died," I shrugged. "Didn't have anyone to live for then." Ruth's voice became fierce. "You do now." In March, the snow melted and my mining crew returned. I introduced Ruth to them. Samuel the foreman was a former Union soldier with a level head. Two-Bit was an old prospector missing 3 fingers. Young Tom was an orphan I'd hired the previous year. The Dutchman barely spoke English. And Ezra was a black freedman who knew more about geology than any college professor. Ruth noticed immediately that the crew was living in ragged tents. "They deserve better," she told me. "A bunkhouse would cost $400 in lumber," I said. "And how much are you paying them?" $2 a day, fair wage." "Then they deserve fair shelter. Build the bunkhouse." I grinned. "Yes, ma'am." The bunkhouse was completed by May. The crew's loyalty to us became absolute. Word spread through the territory. The Blackwoods paid fair wages and treated workers with dignity. In May, a young woman named Sarah arrived at our cabin, 19 years old and 8 months pregnant, abandoned by her husband. "They said you might help," she said desperately. "I have nowhere else." Ruth didn't hesitate. "Come inside." I started to object. "We can't take in every stray." "Why not?" Ruth asked. "You took me in." That was different. How? I realized it wasn't different at all. Sarah stayed. Ruth delivered her baby, a girl named Hope, in June. Sarah became Ruth's first real friend. In July, Ruth realized she was pregnant. 3 months of missed cycles. Morning sickness that left her pale and shaking. She told me while we were checking the trap lines. "I'm having a baby," she blurted. I stopped walking and turned slowly. "You're sure? 3 months missed, sickness every morning. Pretty sure." I sat down on a fallen log, looking stunned. "You're not happy?" Ruth asked, worry creeping into her voice. "I'm terrified," I admitted. "My father was a drunk. My mother abandoned me. What if I turn out like them?" Ruth sat beside me and took my hand. "You're not them. You're the man who bought a woman's freedom with gold and never asked for anything in return. You're the man who built a bunkhouse because miners deserve dignity. You'll be a good father." I looked at her. "We'll be good parents. Together." I built a cradle from pine. Ruth sewed baby clothes. Sarah helped, grateful to have a way to repay our kindness. News from town reached us occasionally. Preston Whitmore had been sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for embezzlement. Charlotte Ashford had been fined, socially ruined, and had moved to California. Evelyn Whitmore had married a hardware salesman and was living quietly. Owen Brennan, we heard, had died in San Francisco of liver failure. Ruth felt nothing at the news. He'd already died to her on that creek bank. On our first anniversary, we rode down to Ashford Springs together. The Grand Hotel was being rebuilt. People nodded respectfully as we passed. Children waved. They don't laugh anymore, Ruth said quietly. They respect strength, I replied. You showed them yours. The labor began on a February night during a blizzard. Of course it was during a blizzard. I rode through the whiteout to fetch a midwife from the Shoshone camp 5 miles away. The midwife, an ancient woman named Dove, arrived with her herbs and her knowledge. Sarah assisted. I paced outside like a caged wolf. 15 hours later, just as dawn broke, a baby's cry pierced the mountain silence. Dove emerged, her weathered face creasing into a smile. You have a daughter, Blackwood. Strong lungs like her mother. I entered the cabin to find Ruth propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle. Her name is Mary, Ruth whispered, after my mother. I took the baby with my massive, gentle hands. She was impossibly small, impossibly perfect. Her tiny hand gripped my finger and something in my chest cracked open. She's perfect, I said. You're perfect. Ruth smiled tiredly. She's loud, like you. The years passed. In 1881, we had a son, William, named after my grandfather. In 1883, another daughter, Clara. Our mining empire grew as I discovered 2 more veins, but we remained modest in our lifestyle. We built a school for the miners' children. Ruth taught reading. In 1885, I reluctantly served a single term as territorial representative because Ruth insisted it was my duty. Ruth became known throughout the territory as the Mountain Queen. Not for her size, but for her fairness and generosity. She served on school boards. She advocated for women's property rights. In 1887, tragedy struck. William died of scarlet fever at age 6. The grief nearly broke us. We clung to each other through the long nights, the marriage deepening through shared sorrow. In 1888, we had another son. We named him Daniel. By the 1890s, Ruth was in her 40s, still large but healthy. I was graying but still strong. The mines produced steadily. Our fortune grew to over $400,000, equivalent to millions in future money. Mary married a school teacher. Clara became one of the first female doctors in Wyoming. Daniel joined the Army. I paused in my story, looking at Thomas across the table. It was late now, well past midnight. The fire had burned down to embers. And that's how I found your grandmother, I said. Thomas shook his head in wonder. By almost getting burned alive. Ruth entered from the kitchen, carrying a pie that smelled of cinnamon and apples. At 66, she still moved with quiet grace. By learning to trust someone who saw past the packaging, she said, sitting beside me. Thomas leaned forward. Grandpa, I'm scared. What if I can't tell who to trust down in Texas in the oil fields when things get dangerous? You watch what they do, not what they say, I told him. Ruth reached into a drawer and pulled out a small leather pouch. This was my mother's, she said, opening it to reveal a sewing needle and wax thread. She brought this from Boston. I used it to fix your grandfather's boot the day we met. I'm giving it to you. Thomas looked confused. A sewing needle for the oil fields. A needle can mend more than cloth, Daniel, Ruth said, using his middle name. It can mend wounds, repair equipment, fix what's broken. Men who can build are stronger than men who can only destroy. Thomas took it carefully, reverently. Your grandmother's right, I said. I've killed men, Thomas. It doesn't make me proud. What makes me proud is what I built. This homestead, this family, this life with her. Ruth's hand found mine on the table. And when you come home, when not, if you'll have a place here. Always. The next morning we stood on the porch and watched Thomas ride down the valley road toward his future. Ruth leaned against me and I wrapped my arm around her waist. He'll be all right, she said. How do you know? Because he's ours, and we don't raise quitters. The years continued to pass. Daniel survived the oil fields and came home in 1926. He married in 1928 and had 3 children. He would run the Blackwood Mining Company until his death in 1972. I died peacefully in 1926 at the age of 80 with Ruth beside me. My last words to her were the same as my first real words. You fixed me. Ruth lived until 1943, reaching the age of 89. She wrote 4 volumes of poetry that were published to quiet acclaim. She founded Wyoming's first women's shelter, a place where women fleeing violent husbands could find safety and dignity. Before she died, a young reporter from Cheyenne came to interview her. He asked if she regretted staying in Wyoming, marrying a stranger, enduring the hard years. Ruth looked out the window at the Bridger Range, still magnificent, still home. I regret nothing, she said. Because I learned that true wealth isn't gold in the ground. It's the person who sees gold in you when everyone else sees mud. The cabin still stands today, a historical landmark. Tourists visit it in the summer, walking through the rooms where we lived and loved and built a life. They see the books, the cradle I carved, the wedding photograph we finally sat for in 1890. But they don't see what really mattered. They don't see the quiet moments. Ruth reading by firelight, me chopping wood while she hung laundry, the thousand small kindnesses that make a marriage. They don't see the boots she mended, or the tears she dried, or the strength she showed when the whole town tried to break her. They just see a cabin and some old furniture and think they understand. But understanding comes from living it, from choosing to see worth when the world says worthless, from trusting actions over appearances, from building something that lasts longer than gold. Our descendants still live in Wyoming. They carry our names and our stories. They know that their great-great-grandmother was called Big Ruth until she became the Mountain Queen. They know their great-great-grandfather was called a savage until people learned what real strength looked like. And on quiet nights when the wind comes down from the Bridger Range, they say you can still hear the echo of a needle through leather, the sound of something broken being made whole. They called him the ghost of the Bridger Range. But ghosts are just memories, and some memories are worth keeping forever. The fire is burning low now. The story is told. Tomorrow, another generation heads out to make their way in the world. They carry with them a sewing needle and a lesson that the strongest foundations are built on seeing what others miss, on choosing substance over surface, on fixing what's broken instead of throwing it away. In 1878, I was a man who hated humanity. By 1880, I was a father. By 1924, I was a grandfather teaching what I'd learned. The lesson is simple. Love is not what it looks like. It's what it does. It's not the ruby ring or the silk dresses. It's the hand that mends your boot without being asked. It's the person who walks through fire beside you. It's choosing every day to see the gold when everyone else sees mud. Ruth Brennan taught me that. The town joke. The seamstress no one noticed. The woman who became a queen without ever leaving the mountain. She fixed my boot that November day in 1878, but really she fixed me, and that made all the difference.